Do you wish that all things wealth and finance were much easier to understand and not presented by a bunch of beige cardigan-wearing geeks? Welcome to the Clever Investor Podcast, where we're dishing up the easiest to understand finance program served in bite-sized chunks, so your brain will thank you as your knowledge grows. Hosted by the brilliant Owen Taylor, a multiple award-winning expert with a glorious knack for explaining the complex world of wealth in the simplest of ways.
Hello, clever investors, and welcome to another show. Today, we're going to talk about a self-managed super fund. And I've just lost all the 20-something years old. No, come back. I promise you, you'll get something out of this episode. So the definition of super or superannuation, I'm going to refer to it as super because superannuation is such a tongue-tiring word to actually say. So super is, by definition, forced savings by our government. Every time you get a paycheck, the government says to your payroll office, you have to put 9.5% minimum of your employee's salary into a nominated account. And in the case of most people, it's a super fund account. And that is literally forced savings for our retirement. Now, the reason why I didn't want the 20-something-year-olds to tune out is because the scary figures are that over 92% of all Australians are still retiring on less than $42,000 a year. The sooner you can start thinking about these things in life, the so much better, because you're giving yourself more opportunity for choice. Now, the average super balances at retirement is about $270,000 for men, and it's under $160,000 for women. Traditionally, women in a husband and wife situation, when you're having your 2.3 kids and such, the wife, the female of the relationship, is unfortunately the one who then stops the full-time paid work. They're doing all this full-time unpaid work, and therefore their super balances are then really suffering from it. A couple of years ago now, the Australian Financial Security Authority did a bit of a calculation and survey, and they estimated to have a comfortable retirement for the average Australian, for the middle of the bell curve Australian, the single person would need about $545,000. And the figures that I've just said to you before is we're looking well under that for the average Australian couple. So we need to start thinking about what we're actually going to do with this, how we're going to do it, how we're going to combat it. And remember, as I keep saying through all of these episodes, you are not on your own. You're not meant to know the answers to all of these big and scary financial questions. There's a whole team of wonderful people out there to actually help you with it. Most Australians just go by the default super fund that their employer sort of presents in front of them. I remember as a 16-year-old when I first started into the workforce, I didn't give a toss about super. They just put it into a fund and that was it. Not surprisingly, over 40% of Australians have multiple super accounts. If you're a 40-something-year-old or even a 30-something-year-old adult, you've probably changed your job every somewhere between 3 to 7 years. And when you've moved, you've kind of left that super account over, at XYZ, and you've started with a new company and they've said they're going to put it into their whiz-bang super fund. And it's not uncommon that I've seen up to 5 separate super accounts. Having these multiple accounts obviously means that when you've got an account, there's going to be an account service fee. And that's costing you an extra $2.6 billion in fees every single year. unless on your business card, the title on your business card is financial advisor. Do not go and play with your super funds. Now, the vast majority, over 60% of Australians, have no choice or have no part in making a choice on where their super is actually invested into. So think about this, as I said before, this is forced savings. So the government says you've got to put, 9.5% of your weekly, monthly income into this account, and you're not allowed to touch that account until you're old and grey. And it's designed to actually help the government not have to pay us a pension, because there's more and more Australians living later in life. We're all a lot healthier later in life. And it would be impossible for the Australian government now to support us all just on a pension. So we need to become self-funded retirees. Now, the other place that people can invest their super into, where their employee contributions can go into, is a thing called a self-managed super fund. And I want to explain to you the differences between a self-managed super fund, or as it's easily known as an SMSF, self-managed super fund, or so a self-managed super fund, the difference between that and your, let's say, industry super fund, the super fund that most Australians are putting their money into, is the fact that you are deciding where you're actually going to be investing into. It could be shares, it could be properties, it can be actually other things as well. You can even just leave it in cash. The correct name would actually be to call it a self-deciding super fund, because you're deciding where your super fund is actually going to invest its money. And you can change that over the years. It doesn't mean it's all set in stone at the very beginning. You can certainly move in and out of cash and super and property as the years go by. And it works quite simply like this. You have control over where you want to invest, and you're obviously going to gather knowledge and information from trusted sources about where you should be putting your money, where you shouldn't be putting your money. So you can invest in various different asset classes. The most common ones for self-managed super funds are cash, the share market, or into property. And you can invest in residential property, or you can invest into commercial property. You can also have up to 4 different members in your self-managed super fund. The most common is 2 members, and that's normally a husband and wife or life partners. It's not uncommon, though, to have 2 married couples that are in it, mum and dad and their kids. It's whatever suits your purpose. Now, I mentioned this before, but you can, if you're looking at property, you can invest in commercial property, and you can also invest in residential property. Now, with commercial property, the most common things that I've seen over the years is small businesses, small to medium-sized businesses that would actually buy the premise that they're running their business from and put that into their self-managed super fund. Now, the advantages of that is that you are now effectively your own landlord. So you're not going to get kicked out in 3 or 5 years when the lease ends. Your lease is literally going on for forever and ever. And actually, if you sell the business or sort of retire out of the business or something, then whoever takes over the business, whether it's family members or whether you're actually just selling it, then you've got an income coming in from that as well. The other alternative is residential property. So it can be houses, it can be apartments, it can be townhouses. You can't do house and land, so you can't have 2 separate contracts in it. You could buy a completed house, but you couldn't buy a block of land and then build on the land. It's actually not compliant with super rulings there as well. With residential property, you or any immediate family member cannot live in the property. So with commercial property, yes, you can have your own business in there because effectively it's under a different sort of structure. The business is a separate entity. With residential property, effectively the government is worried that you're going to rent it to yourself at a lower than market value and therefore sort of shoot yourself in the foot 20, 30 years time because you've been paying bugger all rent for all these years. Back in 2008, there was about $10 billion worth of residential property that was invested through self managed super funds. Up to a couple of years ago, that had risen dramatically to about $35 billion worth of property. So it's an ever growing market. So, how do you actually buy property in your self managed super funds? Well, first thing is you actually need to have one set up. So, the person that actually will help you set up a self managed super fund, and you can do these things on your own. Yes, just like many things in life, you can go and buy a kit, you can go online, you can look at how to do it, but please don't bother doing it as well. You could also, take your own appendix out as well. I'm sure there's something on YouTube about doing that, but just don't do it. There's experts out there that do this type of thing all day, every day, and they really don't charge that much. Financial advisor can set up your super fund, but the step back from that is they're actually also they've got to evaluate whether it is actually the right thing for you to do. If you don't have enough money in super, and as a general rule of thumb at the moment, if you have less than about $250,000 in your super fund, it's not worth setting up a self-managed super fund because the super fund can borrow money to buy property, but it can only borrow up to about 65%. So you've got to put in a fair amount of money. You've got to put in at least 40% plus allow 5% for costs because you're still going to pay stamp duty and you've still got legal fees and such. And you also, as well, a lot of the lenders to self-managed super funds for property require that you have a balance, still a cash balance still in your super fund. So if you've got less than 250,000, quite honestly, you're going to end up buying a property which is not something that I'd recommend that anybody actually buys into at all. So if you've only got enough to buy a $150,000 property, a $200,000 property, quite honestly, at the moment, I'd say no matter where you're buying in Australia, don't bother. So you need a minimum of about 240, 250. So as I mentioned before, the super fund can borrow money. It's restricted at the moment to a loan to value ratio of about 60 to 70%. You're going to pay a slightly higher interest rate than what you would on your normal family home. I've never actually quite understood why, because I think that self-managed super fund borrowing is so much safer than people buying investment properties in their personal names or even buying their own homes as well. Because in order for you to buy a property in a self-managed super fund, you've got to get sign off from your financial advisor, who has to do a massive piece of paperwork actually saying that, yes, this is a good decision. They've got to do all their duty of care. You've got to have an accountant that does an audit on everything there as well. And your mortgage broker as well, who's going to go and get you the finance, has then also got all these rules and regulations from the individual lenders as to making sure everything is compliant, because they're all so terrified of being slapped on the wrist by the government and ASIC. So there's so much more protection with it. I don't know why the banks are not jumping on this stuff. I actually need to make a note here and get somebody in from Bankland to talk to us about why they don't lend as much against super. So I'm just making a note here. We'll have that on a show soon. Now, your financial advisor is going to work out whether your affordability, whether you should actually do it, whether you can afford it. Now, remembering as well with property in a self-managed super fund, not only are you putting money towards it, you've got your tenant putting money towards it. If we're looking at the advantages of a self-managed super fund, then it's highly considered to be a tax-friendly environment. So any asset that you have in a self-managed super fund, effectively, when you liquidate that asset and you are retired, it's literally tax-free. So if you have a property in your super fund, you bought it for $500,000 today, by the time you retire, it's worth $800,000. Any of the profit on that, if it wasn't in super, if it was in your personal name, you'd be liable for a capital gains tax. But when it's in a self-managed super fund, then you're not liable for that, because you can liquidate it, the money goes back into the super fund, and then because you're the boss of your own super fund, you then decide, okay, I'm going to pay myself X amount each month out of this sort of profit that it's made. Remember, you're a self-funded retiree. This is, the government wants us to look after ourselves when we get into retirement phase. The other advantages are you're actually leveraging from the money you got. So remember I said before, you probably need at the moment, rough rule of thumb, you need about 240 to 250 in that. So that money on its own is not that much. Think back to one of the early things I said as well, that you need, the average single person needs nearly $550,000 to have a comfortable retirement. So if you've got 250 here, you could actually leverage from that, use some of that 250 to go and buy a $500,000 property in super, hold it for however many years you need to, depending on what your age is. And that's actually then increasing your asset base within your super fund, right, for your benefit. Unfortunately, it's not something that suits everybody. Sometimes the balance on your super is just too low to be able to do anything. And as I mentioned before, there are ways around this. There are ways of thinking about it. It might be combining with a friend that could be in a similar situation to you, with siblings as well. I've done that a lot, where it's brothers and sisters actually then helping each other out, later on too. Age is a big factor in it, and liquidity of your super may be tied up in something else that you just can't release it from, or it's too good a deal to actually take it out from what it is as well. And it just isn't. The third thing is really the strategy that you've got as well. Maybe you have all good intentions to start a self-managed super fund, but maybe there just isn't enough time within your strategy to get you to where you want to go. You don't have to figure these things out on your own. I'm always going to stress these type of things as well. It's a bit like going to your doctor. You've got to find someone that you trust and then actually go with the advice that they're actually saying. I hope you've enjoyed today, and I will see you again very soon on the next edition of the Clever Investor Podcast.
You have been listening to the Clever Investor Podcast, a weekly podcast dishing up the easiest to understand finance program served in bite-sized chunks, so your brain will thank you as your knowledge grows. If you enjoyed the show, we'd love you to leave a review. It's the best way for us to reach new listeners. For more information, go to thecleverinvestor.com.au.